Hello, I'm Tom Troutman. It's a great pleasure to introduce our guest, Raman Sukumar, who's come all the way from Bangalore via such exotic and difficult to reach places as Brazil and New Haven, Connecticut, and actually managed to get a flight canceled. So that he's made it here is a pleasure. I had the pleasure a year ago, last winter, to speak in his place. He is the head of the professor and head of the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. A well-known Asian elephant and elephants in general expert. His PhD was at the Indian Institute of Science in 1985 with a dissertation on elephants, which eventuated in his first book, The Asian Elephant, Ecology and Management, which is a very good book. A little tough, but very good. I urge you to read it. And you will learn in it, for example, that Asian elephants actually eat more browse than grass, in case you were wondering, the leaves of trees and bushes, and they're not actually mainly grass eaters, they're mainly browse eaters. Bangalore, where he lives and works and was educated, is near the largest concentration of Asian elephants in the world. That is, the borderlands of the states of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, in places with names like Mudumalai, Bandipur, Kabani Lake, Nagarhole, and Periyar. Also Bilagiri Rangan, where he did his doctoral research. And these are wonderful places to visit and see live wild elephants, as my wife and I found out last winter when we visited some of these places. Sukumar has many publications. He has 4 books. In the dissertation book I mentioned, Elephant Days and Nights, 10 Years with the Indian Elephant, The Living Elephants, Evolutionary Ecology, Behavior, and Conservation. And just last year, I was fortunate to be at the book launch, The Story of Asia's Elephants. And I have brought only the dust jacket because the book itself, being full of color illustrations, is exceedingly heavy, but very delightful to read. And I urge you to look for it. It is published by Marg, and it has been available in this country only since July. So look for The Story of Asia's Elephants. He has published and co-published over 100 articles. I stopped counting after 100. Distributed over 3 fields, basically: wildlife ecology, meaning elephants, but also other large mammals in which India is so very rich, like the sambar and the nilgai and wild dogs and other wonderful species. Tropical forest ecology. He has an army of students monitoring the life histories of 50,000 trees in South India, and they have to check up on those trees once a year. And other things in this territory. And finally, climate change. And when I say climate change, I mean over the last 40,000 years, a very, very long time depth indeed. So he's very, very heavily involved, he and his students, in these 3 areas. He's very well known as an elephant expert. He is on the Indian Board for Wildlife and the Project Elephant Steering Committee, which published a report which you may find online that was published in 2010, a very interesting report on the condition of elephants in India. He's a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences and the Indian National Science Academy. This is interesting. He contributed to an intergovernmental panel on climate change that shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. So he's a Nobelist. One of the very few we've had the pleasure of hearing from in this forum, I must say, which is quite delightful. And among his many other honors, and I won't list them all, the one that caught my eye was the Order of the Golden Ark from the Netherlands. I imagine that's Noah's Ark is what that means. I'm not sure. But anyway, please help me welcome to Ann Arbor Raman Sukumar.
Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. After all the stormy goings on in the Northeast, I was wondering whether I would actually get to Ann Arbor, but fortunately I managed to do so. Because a similar talk at Yale University was cancelled the other day, and I'm glad that I managed to come over here. This is actually my second visit to Ann Arbor, a little longer than my previous visit. That was more than 10 years ago, where I visited Dan Fisher's lab. I think Dan is somewhere in the audience here. As Tom mentioned, what I really do is, what I really enjoy doing is being out in the field, observing elephants, studying elephants, and increasingly, of course, it's mostly my students who get to do a lot of the fun work than I do. But I'm hoping that, and Tom actually made an error when he said that I'm the head of the Center for Ecological Sciences. I stepped down just a day before I left India. I stepped down as chair after 8 years. So I hopefully will have more time to be among the elephants in the future. Over several years of giving lectures on elephants, on their behavior, their conservation, their ecology, one question that kept coming up to me all the time was, why is it that only the Asian elephant has been captured? Why not the African elephant? In general, audiences in the West had two impressions of the Asian elephant. One impression was that Asian elephants were all doing fine, everything was fine, and there's no problem with the Asian elephant. And the other impression was that, there's no Asian elephant in the wild. You only had Asian elephants in captivity. And the African elephant had never been captured. And one question that always used to come up was, why is it that the Asian elephant had been captured and tamed and put to the use of humans, but the African elephant has never played that role? I knew that African elephants also had a cultural history, but this history was much more brief than that the Asian elephant has enjoyed. The Asian elephant has enjoyed a much longer cultural association with people, and the elephant-human relationship has been far richer, between the Asian elephant and people. And this is the subject of about 6 or 7 years of research that I did for my new book that Tom just flagged the jacket of this book. There have been, when you talk about the relationship between an animal and humans, I would say that the dog has probably been more faithful to humans than the elephant has been. The horse has perhaps won more battles for humans than the elephant has won. The cow has perhaps served to nourish human populations to a far greater extent and has been more useful to humans than the elephant has. But I think the sheer contrast and splendor of the elephant-human relationship, and by the elephant I mean the Asian elephant, is, I think, something that has never arisen in the past, that kind of a relationship, and I predict would never ever arise in the future. I think it's been a unique relationship between elephants and people. But on the other hand, again, the question still remains as to why. I mean, the African elephant is not very different from the Asian elephant. It's only, in terms of biological evolution, it was only separated about 6 or 7 million years ago. In fact, the Asian elephant itself comes from Africa and came out of the African continent about a few million years ago. So, and it's not as though the African elephant had not been tamed. But why is it that in the two continents we have had these very, very contrasting histories? And of course, one distinct difference is that the Asian elephant has not just been captured and tamed and put to the use of people and used in cultural expressions such as this. This is the Trishur Puram festival in Kerala. And you will see similar expressions or cultural expressions in Kandy if you go to the Perahera, for instance. And, many small temples have elephants and, cultural festivities. You go to a wedding, the bridegroom comes on an elephant back. And Tom just showed me the card of an elephant keeper, elephant wala from Delhi, who hires elephants out for wedding events and so on and so forth. But one distinct difference is that the elephant has, in the Asia, has been raised to sacred status and eventually to supreme godhead. And by that I mean Ganesh. I'll come to Gajatame a little later because I don't think people realize the real significance of Gajatame before Gajatame came several hundred years before Ganesh, and I'll come to that. But eventually, for most people, on my flight yesterday, is the person who was on the flight with me, I don't know, she said she'd probably come for my talk today. But, we started speaking about elephants, and she said, and she immediately what popped up in her mind was Ganesh, but what about Ganesh, she said. And I said, oh, Ganesh, then you need to come for my talk tomorrow because I'm going to talk about Ganesh. And she couldn't really believe it, but I opened my computer and showed her the front part of the title of my talk. That Ganesh obviously symbolizes the elephant culture today to most, in the eyes of most people. But Ganesh is not just a Hindu god, it's not just an Indian god, but a pan-Asian god because Ganesh originated in India, but eventually went out through Nepal, into Tibet, into China, into Japan, and into Southeast Asia. There are lots of expressions of Ganesh, and eventually some rather bizarre expressions of Ganesh, which, if I show you some pictures, which I don't have on my talk, you may not believe it. You have tantric Ganeshas in Indonesia sitting on a bed of human skulls, and what the significance of those things are is very interesting. So the question here is what is the significance of the elephant culture in Asia? Why did it arise, and why is this big contrast with that of the African elephant culture? Well, I think I start my story, I can start a little bit earlier. I can start with the Stone Age and the Stone Age relationship between elephants and people, but I'll start with the Indus Valley civilization. This is an ancient civilization that flourished about 4,000 years ago, 5,000 to about 4,000, 3,500 years ago. And among the material remains of this civilization are seals, or the steatized seals, the small seals. And one doesn't really know what these seals were used for. Some people think that merchants were using these seals as, for their merchandise, like much like we sort of put a seal on goods and send it out today. But you look very carefully at the seal, you will see what looks like a cloth that is draped over the back of this elephant. Okay, these are very tiny seals. They're just about, a centimeter and a half, the dimensions. And there are hundreds of these seals that have been found. There are a number of different animals depicted in these seals. Elephant is not necessarily the most common, but elephant is very much there. So what looks like a cloth draped over the back of this elephant. And a lot of people have argued that this seems to indicate that the elephant had been tamed by the Indus Valley civilization. The extent of the Indus civilization was far greater than that of Egyptian and the Mesopotamian civilization combined. It encompassed, pretty much the entire present-day Pakistan. It encompassed a large part of India, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and a bit of Afghanistan too. And it's a huge, huge area that it encompassed. But this interpretation is still open to doubt because there are many seals that have these lines on the back. You have the unicorn with these lines, you have the rhinoceros with these lines, so it could still be open to debate because there's no rider on this elephant on the back of the seal if you look closely. On the other hand, there is this terracotta figurine that you see in the picture below, and this is from a museum in Mohenjo-daro in Pakistan, and this seal, this terracotta figurine goes back to about 1900 BCE, or very close to 4,000 years before present. And if you look closely, unfortunately, the colors have not come out too well on this. It has bands on the forehead. And if you were to look at this, and if you were to look at the way that captive elephants are, caparisoned, before a festivity, you will actually see that these colors are faded, but you look very closely, you will see these faint bands. After all, these were painted 4,000 years ago, and you can't expect the bands to remain today. But this is very clear, seems to be very clear evidence that the elephant had been tamed. So I have looked at all the different evidences that are there and cautiously concluded that the elephant had certainly been tamed by the time of the Indus Valley civilization. But this is not to say that the Indus people were the first people to tame the elephant. Because if you look at I don't know if I have a map of that, I'm not very sure if I put that, probably not, that the distribution of the elephant in the Indus Valley actually remained, more or less at the periphery of the distribution of wild elephants. So it is in all likelihood, I think, the non-Aryan tribes of the subcontinent, prior to the Indus Valley civilization, had actually perhaps tamed elephants. But elephants had also been tamed, certainly by the Indus time. Now, the key question to me is, why did the elephant become sacred, and when did the elephant become sacred? There is this very well-known seal, the Pashupati seal. The Pashupati seal is, some people interpret Pashupati, this horned deity seated on some kind of a throne or whatever, or a chair, and there are these 4 animals above this deity. So you have the buffalo from the top left lower, you have the rhinoceros, and you have the elephant, and then you have the tiger. So some people, A.K. Narayan, for instance, historian A.K. Narayan interprets this as saying that there is a hint of sacredness in this, perhaps. Okay, there is a horned deity surrounded by animals, sacred animals, but whether the tiger was considered sacred, or whether the buffalo could have been, but whether the rhino was considered sacred is not very clear. But there is a certain hint of sacredness. And a lot of people associate this with Shiva. This is a proto-Shiva figurine from the Indus period. But no firm indication that the elephant had become sacred during the period of the Indus period. We then, around 1500 BCE, we have the so-called Aryan people who came into the subcontinent from the northwest of the country, and these were the Vedic people. When the Aryan people came into the subcontinent, they had no idea of the elephant. It was essentially a horse-based culture. And if you look at the early Vedic texts, such as the Rig Veda, there are references to the elephant. There are a few references to the elephants in the Rig Veda. The elephant is called a Mrigahasti. A Mrigahasti means an animal with a hand. And obviously an elephant with a trunk, looks like the trunk looks like a hand. It's a very apt description. There are many other descriptions of the elephant in the Rig Veda, but there's absolutely no hint of sacredness of the elephant in the Rig Vedic period. But a slightly later Vedic text, the Atharva Veda, for instance, there's an entire hymn devoted to, this is book 3, hymn 22, and I'll just read out this a few sentences from this hymn. This is devoted, there's an entire hymn in the Atharva Veda devoted to describing the attributes of an elephant that was to be used as a royal mount. Okay, so famed be the elephant's strength, the lofty glory, which out of Aditi's body took existence, and so on and so forth. Now hath the elephant become chief of all pleasant beasts to ride. Now hath his fortune and his strength I grace and consecrate myself. Okay, so this is how the hymn ends. So obviously the elephant was greatly admired, and this was the period between the Rig Veda and the Atharva Veda of a horse-based culture, coming to assimilate the elephant culture, the local elephant culture. And the elephant was given a lofty status, but there's no indication of sacredness. And in the Rig Veda, if you read descriptions of Indra was a king of gods. Indra always rode a horse. In the Vedas, there is absolutely no indication of Indra riding an elephant. Indra riding an elephant came much later. There are descriptions, of course, in the Mahabharata and so on, much later. But it took at least 1,000 years later that Indra started, after all, what is a horse when you compare it with an elephant as a royal mount? It's much grander to ride an elephant than a horse. So naturally, Indra could not be content, the king of gods could not be content with just riding a horse. He had to ride a royal elephant, and this was a sacred elephant, Airavata. And the earliest depiction of this, visual depiction of this is there in some of the ancient texts before this time. This is from the Baja caves near Pune from the 1st century. This is the most ancient depiction of this sculpture that I found. But again, no hint of sacredness of the elephant as yet, in the Vedic period, at least in the Vedic period. We then pass very briefly through the period of the 2 epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, that go back to the early part of the 1st millennium BCE. And I don't have to get into descriptions of what the Ramayana means or the Mahabharata means. I think the descriptions of the elephants in the Ramayana are more sober and more authentic compared to the descriptions in the Mahabharata, because the Mahabharata is the world's longest epic. It has been written over a much longer time period. There have been lots of interpolations, so the dating of that is not very clear. There is obviously a mistake in this painting of which is 18th century, but that I will come to. In the Ramayana, elephants are mentioned very frequently, but usually as a mount for royals and for nobles. There is the occasional mention of use of elephants in battle, but no large-scale deployment. There are mention of individual elephants with individual names used in battle, but strangely, it's not Rama's army that has the elephants. It's usually Ravana's army that has the elephants. So when Rama and his monkey army actually, with Hanuman and the monkey army crosses the ocean and goes into Lanka, all the wild elephants and the captive elephants of Lanka, they get frightened and they run away. So the descriptions are that as you go from north to south, there are larger numbers of elephants, which perhaps is some kind of an indication of the ecological status of the habitat and of the elephant population. Because in the north, with the capture of elephants in the Gangetic Basin, the settlements came up and the elephants would have been wiped out. And as you go further south, the abundance of the elephant population increased. But it's Ravana's army that has more elephants. And you can actually write the entire history of the Ramayana. The interesting thing about the Ramayana to me, when I read the archetype Ramayana, which is the critical edition, which is published by Princeton University Press, is that you can tell the entire story of the Ramayana by mentioning the word elephant in every sentence. And I have attempted that in 5 pages in my book. So please read my book. With the entire story of the Ramayana by mentioning an elephant in every single sentence, which is what I try to do. And then we have the Mahabharata, which is roughly contemporary, although in terms of the events that it describes, and I think it's later than the Ramayana, but historians would have perhaps a different view. There is much more elaborate descriptions of the use of elephants in battle in the Mahabharata. For instance, the story of Ashwatthama. On the 15th day of the battle was going very badly against the Pandavas, the righteous clan against the Kauravas. And therefore, Krishna comes up with a wonderful idea. He tells the Pandavas that, Drona, who is the master teacher for the Kauravas, who is on the side of the Kauravas, he has a son named Ashwatthama. There was also an elephant named Ashwatthama in the Kauravan army. And he persuades the Pandavas to go and kill the elephant Ashwatthama. So Yudhishthira, the eldest brother of the Pandavas, refuses to do so. But Bhima, he goes and kills the elephant Ashwatthama. And this is depicted in a sculpture in a Hoysala temple very close to Bangalore. This is, of course, 12th century. The point I forgot to make about the earlier painting, the Bahari painting, is that when you read the Ramayana about the use of Raman never rode an elephant in the Battle of Lanka. He only rode a chariot. But obviously, a Pahari painter thought that in the Pahari style that Rama had to ride an elephant, so that painting is not a very authentic depiction of the use of an elephant in battle in the Ramayana. But Bhima kills this elephant Ashwatthama, and then Krishna persuades Yudhishthira to tell Drona, go up to Drona and tell Drona that Ashwatthama is dead. So he goes and, this famous Ashwatthama Hatha Kunjara, the very famous statement that he makes. And he said, the Ashwatthama is dead. Then very softly the elephant. And of course, by the time Krishna starts beating his drums. And so Drona, Yudhishthira is known for his truthfulness. And so Drona believes that, his son Ashwatthama is dead. And he collapses. And therefore, the Pandavas carry the day. It's a very famous story. And so obviously, there is some perhaps truth to the use of elephants in battle at that time. But then there are descriptions of the field unit or Akshauhini of the army. And each Akshauhini is supposed to have 21,640 elephants. These are gross exaggerations. And these are clearly hyperbole in the Mahabharata. These are obviously later day interpolations. And, people built up these stories of these huge elephant armies and huge armies with, large numbers of cavalry and chariots and foot soldiers and so on and so forth. So these are not very authentic descriptions. But what's interesting is that the whole concept of the Chaturanga Sena, or the fourfold division of the army, is elaborated in the Mahabharata, of course, which is ancient Indian armies, certainly by the early part of the first millennium BCE, had this fourfold division. You had the infantry, you had the chariots, you had cavalry, and you had the elephants. And the chariots started declining pretty early on. I looked at whatever evidence is there from the different scriptures, and I concluded that the earliest use of elephants in battle is earlier to the 6th century BCE. That's the best that we can say. It probably goes back to the very early part of the first millennium BCE. And it's certainly earlier to the 6th century BCE. But here again, there is no hint of sacredness in the elephant in the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. At least the archetype, the critical, that could be later day interpolations, especially in the Mahabharata, but there's no hint that the elephant had become sacred during the period of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Now I will just deviate a little bit from my talk. I'll just introduce you to a remarkable text called the Gajasastra. Now the Gajasastra is elephant lore that is attributed to a sage called Palkapya. And Palkapya is a mythical sage. Nobody knows whether Palkapya was there or not, but possibly there was a sage who expounded the science of the elephant. And he's believed to have lived in eastern India around the 5th century BCE. I mention Gajasastra because later on I'll make a reference to Gajasastra in a different context. I just wanted to point out a particular statement. This is from a Matangalila. There are different versions of the Gajasastra or the elephant lore. And the Matangalila of Nilakanta is about 1,000 years old. It says, excitement, swiftness, odor, love passion, complete fluorescence of the body, wrath, prowess, and fearlessness are declared to be the 8 excellences of mast. Now, I'll show you what a mast is. This is a bull elephant in mast. And the ancients were obsessed with elephants in mast because they wanted to have these bull elephants in mast, and the bull elephants in mast were the aggressive ones. So these were the ones that had to be fielded in battle against your opponents and battering the, whether it's charging, being in the front line and charging your enemy, or going and battering down the gates of the forts and so on and so forth. So this single statement, to me as a biologist, I'm basically a biologist. I study elephant behavior and elephant ecology and so on. This single statement actually summarizes all that we know about mast and its significance today. There's nothing, you can't really improve upon this particular definition. It talks about chemical signaling of mast. It talks about the fact that a bull elephant in mast is wanders over a larger area. He becomes very aggressive. He's in search of females in estrus for mating and so on and so forth. So everything is really captured in the single sentence. So people in those days also probably knew something about elephant biology. The second aspect I want to bring to your notice is that the Gajasastra actually, that is the Matangalila, mentions that it starts off by describing Romapada, the king of Anga. Anga is eastern India, Bihar, where there are no elephants today there, was seated on a throne when people reported to him that all the crops of grain were being destroyed by wild elephants. Okay. So this means that conflict between elephants and people is ancient. It's not something new. We think today that conflict is something that is happening only, in recent times. But conflict is not necessarily new. Conflict is quite ancient. And then the king goes and gets the elephants are captured. They are brought into the palace grounds, and then arrives sage Palkapya before the king. It's like a modern animal rights activist, and he goes and pleads with the king to release the elephants back into the wild. He says because he, Palkapya, has wandered among the wild elephants. He has lived among the elephants, and he can tell the life story of the elephant, and then he narrates. And that's the Gajasastra. So I just wanted to make the point that the elephant-human conflict, and this is an aspect I'll come to later when I talk about Ganesha. Okay, we now move to the Mauryan period, where we have Alexander the Great. Alexander was an all-conquering king who came from all the way from Macedonia. He swept, he won every single battle. He defeated Cyrus. He defeated the Persians. He came into northwestern India. He had set his sights upon conquering the ends of the earth. And probably his teacher Aristotle had told him that the ends of India was really the end of the earth. So he comes and there is this very famous battle that, historians have written, whole volumes on this battle between Alexander and King Porus. And Porus was an Indian king who he had 200 elephants. He probably fielded about 80 elephants in this battle of the Jhelum, or the Hydaspes, as the Greeks called it. And Alexander defeats this elephant army of King Porus. Now, interestingly, not many people know that Alexander had elephants with him. Alexander had more than 100 elephants with him. This is not commonly known, but Alexander had more than 100 elephants. A number of other smaller rulers gave tributes to Alexander, before he had this battle. But there are no descriptions of Alexander using the elephants in his battle. So he essentially used his cavalry, and he defeats Porus. The Macedonians then advanced from the Jhelum to the Bias River. And at the Bias River, his soldiers revolt. They refuse to go any further. And Alexander turns back, goes down the Indus, and then after a long and arduous journey, goes back to Babylon with his, with the elephants that he had taken from Porus, and the elephants that he had before he had received from other rulers before that. Now, this is quite a mystery as to why an all-conquering king, emperor, should actually turn back after you defeat an elephant army of King Porus. Well, the Greek sources say that rumors came to Alexander that if he were to advance up to the river Ganges, there were more powerful kings waiting for him with armies of 4,000 elephants. So it is one matter to defeat Porus with his 80 elephant army. It was a completely different matter to perhaps face an army of 4,000 elephants. So I think that Indian history would have been quite different if, the Nandas and the Mauryas, they probably did not have several thousand elephants in the army. I think a lot of historians doubt the exact size of the armies that these ancient kings had, beyond the Ganges River. But my argument is that if Porus had 200 elephants, Porus ruled an area which is outside the major distribution of the wild elephant in ancient times. Alexander also had another 100 elephants, and even the elephants were in Persia and so on and so forth. So if you could have, well beyond the distribution of the wild elephant, you could have 300 to 400 elephants in various armies. Why can't you have 3,000 or 4,000 elephants in the Gangetic Basin, which was teeming with wild elephants? Okay, so I would certainly think that very large armies had already arisen by the Mauryan times, by the time that Alexander had reached the northwest. But after this very short campaign, of course, Alexander goes back to Babylon with his elephants, and that's a different story as to what the role that those elephants and the elephants at Seleucus Nicator, his successors, the role that played in wars, between the Greeks and the Ptolemies and eventually the Romans and so on. Now, so the elephant culture, I think, in ancient times first reached a peak and during the Mauryan times under Chandragupta Maurya and then under Ashoka. And by this time, the Indo-Gangetic Basin was under extensive settlement. The Aryans had come in and raised a lot of settlements, and probably the population of India was certainly several tens of millions by this particular time period. Elephants were, however, still plentiful along the Himalayan foothills and to the south in the Vindhyas, in Kalinga, in Orissa. And this ensured a regular supply of elephants for the armies of these rulers. And Chandragupta Maurya is reputed, according to Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to the court of Chandragupta, he had 9,000 elephants in his army. So even if some of these are somewhat exaggerated, still, there were sizable armies at the time of Chandragupta Maurya. Now I come to the Arthashastra, and I should be very cautious about what I say, because Professor Trotman is really the expert on the Arthashastra. He is the world expert on Arthashastra. I just wanted to point out a few passages from the Arthashastra and the significance of why elephant, Tom has written about the Gajavanas. In fact, his paper of 1982 was an inspiration to me to examine this aspect of the use of elephants in the armies, the distribution of elephants in ancient India and so on more closely. The Arthashastra is a manual of statecraft. The dating of it is again problematic, but it's anywhere between 300 and BCE and about 300 CE, of the Common Era. This is attributed to Kautilya, who was the prime minister of the Mauryan emperor. And the Arthashastra advocated that the king should set up sanctuaries for the protection of elephants. So we think of now protected areas as something being fairly modern in concept, maybe arising in North America or some other part of the world very recently. But there were these Gajavanas that were set up in ancient India, and this is certainly more than probably 2,000 years or so old. And these sanctuaries were to be controlled by a superintendent of elephant forests, and the death penalty imposed on anyone who killed an elephant in this area. And let me read this interesting passage from the Arthashastra. This is a translation by Rangarajan, a more recent translation of the Arthashastra. It says, some teachers say that land with productive forest is preferable to land with elephants because it is a source for a variety of materials, while the elephant forests supply only elephants. Kautilya disagrees. He's very, very clear about it. He says one can create productive forests on many types of land, but not elephant forests. And I think this is the punchline. For one depends on elephants for the destruction of an enemy's forces. Okay. See, it's very clear as to why elephants are needed. There's no hint of sentiment at all in this. In fact, the only hint of sentiment in the Arthasastra is when he says that you can capture an elephant cub because an elephant calf if you want to play with it. That's it. No sentiment at all. He's very hard-nosed about, why you should have conservation of elephants, why you should have elephant forests, why you should set up sanctuaries along the periphery of your kingdom. It's because you need elephants for the army of the kings, and you need elephants to defeat your enemy. He's very, very clear about it. So these are the Gajavanas, and this is a map that is from Professor Trotman's 1982 paper on elephants and the Mauryas. And these are the various Gajavanas, and he has looked at the ancient Sanskrit sources, and he has given a geographical indication of the extent of where these Gajavanas are found. There are two interesting things about this distribution of the Gajavanas. One is that the Arthasastra does not mention elephants in the southern part of the country, and we know that the elephants would have been found. And I think a very simple explanation is that the Mauryan kingdom did not extend to the entire southern part of the country. It stopped short of the present-day Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So they had no knowledge of what lay beyond that. That's very clear. The second aspect, which I think is much more significant for me as an ecologist, is that it says that the elephants of Saurashtra-Vana, and Saurashtra-Vana is in the west, that's number 7, the present-day Gujarat, and it says the Panchananda Vana are mentioned as the worst, which is the northwest. Okay. Now I can believe this because these are arid areas. And I think by that time there would have been so much of ecological degradation that these areas were not capable of producing elephants of the right physique, the Kumaria, the perfect Kumaria, well-built royal elephants. That could be used in the king's armies. So these elephants were inferior elephants, a few elephants that were found here. And the habitat just really could not support a good thriving population of elephants. And similarly in the northwest, by this time there would have been considerable ecological degradation because of the extensive settlement between the Indus and the Gangetic basin. So I think that is something interesting here about the ecological status of the habitat and about the elephant population in these areas by the time of the Kautilya Arthasastra. The Arthasastra also gives very detailed prescriptions about the type of elephant to be captured and so on. It says what type of elephant should not be captured, and essentially what it is saying, it is that if you read all of this, it says that you should capture a 20-year-old tusked elephant, tusked male elephant. Okay, female elephants don't have tusks. So the most desirable thing for a king to do is to go and selectively capture 20-year-old tusked male elephants, because these were the elephants that could be tamed, it could be trained, and they could be used in the armies of the kings. And from a biological viewpoint, I would also argue this was the most prudent way of managing an elephant population, because it's these male elephants, when they are about 15 or 20, they go out and raid crafts, they kill people. They are a big nuisance. Just like probably, adolescent human males are. And so, you capture these elephants, you use them in the king's armies. And and the remaining males are still there. It's a polygynous society, so the birth rate doesn't drop necessarily very much. You still can have a demographically vibrant population from a biological point of view. So, and if you look at the northeast of the country, if you go to places like Assam and Bengal, and you'll find that about 50% of the male elephants don't have tusks today. And in the southern India, only 5% of the males don't have tusks. And this could perhaps reflect a very long history of selective capture of the tusked male. So the gene frequency for the tusked male has gone out of the population over periods of hundreds of years, and it's reduced. So you get a very large tuskless population. That's a tuskless male, and it's a phenotype. And Dan Fisher and I are, interested about tuskless elephants and why this arises and so on. Now I come to the sacred elephant, and the sacred elephant, the elephant first becomes sacred in Buddhism. Interestingly, it's not in Hinduism that the elephant first became sacred. It's really in Buddhism that the elephant became sacred first. The sacred elephant is integral to the birth legend of Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, because his mother, Queen Maya, has a dream that a sacred white elephant came down from heaven and entered her womb, and 9 months later she gives birth to Siddhartha Gautama. So it's integral to this, and this is a clay tablet from Bharut from the 1st century that depicts this story. And this is depicted in almost every major Buddhist monument, has got depictions of this. But the first hint of sacredness really comes from Mauryan times, from Ashoka, who converted to after his bloody battle against Kalinga, in which he admitted to killing more than 100,000 people, that he had a change of heart, and he preached ahimsa, he preached protection of all creatures, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. And I don't know how clearly you can see this rock inscription. This is at Kalsi near Dehradun, and which there is this bull elephant in mast with the engraving which says Gajatame, or the supreme elephant, and this is the first hint of a sacred elephant. So the elephant first became sacred in Buddhist India, and after his victory against Kalinga, he had the supreme elephant Dhauli. Dhauli is near the city of Bhubaneswar, a life-sized elephant carved out of the rock here. And this is supposed to represent the Buddha himself. Now, what we can glean from the elephant culture of Buddhism comes from the understanding of the Jatakas, and we know that the king rode a richly caparisoned elephant, or the elephants were used as a royal mount. The Jatakas mention Hasti Mangala. These are the elephant festivals. They mention the worship of an elephant figure called Hatti Maha. The mention of auspicious elephants, Hasti Dasana, the supreme elephant Gajatame, and all these are in Ashoka's rock and pillar inscriptions. Plus, there is a reference in the early Pali Buddhist literature to a group of people named Hatti Vatikas who worship the elephant. So all this clearly points to elephant becoming sacred in Buddhist India first. Now, the use of elephants in battle is clearly established by this time, but at least in early Buddhist times, there isn't does not seem to have been large-scale deployment, but certainly by Ashokan times, but earlier to that, perhaps not. Among the various rebirths of the Buddha, as the Bodhisattva, the Buddha comes to the earth in the form of a sacred white elephant. There's a wonderful painting from the Ajanta caves. This is my favorite all-time painting of an elephant in the Ajanta caves going back to the 4th century. Okay, we now come to the time of the medieval Hindu culture, and I'll just put up one slide on the Tamil period, which is a story by itself. It's a long time period from about the turn of the Common Era to about the 7th century or so, the time of the Pallavas. This is the sacred white elephant of Ajanta was my favorite painting, all-time painting. This is in Mahabalipuram, Amalapuram, just south of Chennai. This is my favorite elephant sculpture. This elephant is more realistic than is more perfect than any real elephant I've ever seen, and this is my favorite elephant sculpture. The Sangam period of the ancient Tamils, bull elephants are used in battle, but no large-scale deployment, as in the north. And elephants are very commonly mentioned. There's a lot of information about elephants in the Sangam period and so on and so forth, but nothing really to indicate that elephants were sacred in the Tamil culture. But all this, of course, was to change in the north, and this is from around the time of the Kushan period, approximately the time of the Kushan period, and certainly by the time of the Guptas. Now, Ganesha, a lot of people don't realize that Ganesha is relatively recent. Ganesha is not a very ancient deity. Ganesha is relatively recent. This is the most ancient sculpture of Ganesha that I could find. This is a Kushan Ganesha. This is in the Mathura Museum, and there are probably 2 or 3 of similar kinds of figures of Ganesha. This is very small. It's actually not. It's only about a foot in height. It was actually kept in a old godown, which they managed with great difficulty to get it out and show it to me. Unfortunately, we don't look after our sculptures very well. It's the most ancient Ganesha ever known. This is a Ganesha from Cambodia, 7th century, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And that's a Hoysala Ganesha. So the whole history of Ganesha, what's the real significance of Ganesha? Now, Ganesha does not appear in the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. And there are no known images of Ganesha BCE. Okay. The earliest classical images, I showed you some, are about the 3rd or 4th century and not earlier to that. So Ganesha is a relatively recent entrant into the Hindu pantheon of gods. And the earliest literary references are also approximately the 5th century or later, especially in the Puranas and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, why is it that the elephant became sacred? Why is it that you have this emergence of this? I'll just go back to this for a minute. There are, in Hindu mythology, there are a large number of animal-headed deities. We have Vishnu Garuda, who has an eagle's beak and wings. We have Varaha with a boar's head, and Narsimha with a lion's head, which is the 3rd and the 4th avatar of Vishnu. And however, Ganesha is very different. Ganesha is standing, he's sometimes sitting, he's even dancing. He's pot-bellied. It's a comical elephant-headed Gana. The Ganas were impish. They are attendants of the Lord Shiva. His legs are stunted, his left tusk is broken, his trunk is twisted with his tip dipping into a bowl of sweets. He's holding his broken tusk, an elephant goad, a rosary, sugar cane, and riding the lowly rat, finally. His Vahana is a rat, and seemingly a most unlikely god, So I think there is a historian called Paul Cootwright, who wrote a book in which he says there's no need for a theoretical construct of Ganesha. And I said, I disagree. I think there has every reason for a theoretical construct of Ganesha. And historian Wendy O'Flaherty actually summarizes the essence of Ganesha in these terms, and I'll just quote. Ganesha has everything that is fascinating to anyone who is interested in religion or India or both. Charm, mystery, popularity, sexual problems, moral ambivalence, political importance, the works. One can start from Ganesha and work from there in an unbroken line to almost any aspect of Indian culture. And we started thinking about it as to why Ganesha became sacred. And I think at this stage, to cut a long story short, I want to draw a parallel with the origin of another sacred animal in India, which is the cow. And I go back to what anthropologist Marvin Harris has said about the origin of the sacred cow, and he's written 2 or 3 articles about it, and one of the chapters in his book, Cows, Pigs, Wars and Witches in 1974. His thesis was that essentially with the spread of Aryan settlements across the Indo-Gangetic basin, there's an intensification of production and a population explosion in ancient times in India. And eventually at some stage the cow became more useful alive than dead. We know that in ancient times that people ate beef in India. The Brahmins ate beef in India, and this is very contentious. Right-wing Hindus today don't want to accept the fact that more than 2,000 years ago beef was consumed. But and a book published by a person called Jha has been banned in India because he said that you have beef consumed more than 2,000 years ago in India. Whatever it is. Eventually, vegetarianism essentially arose, and a taboo on consumption of beef arose because the cow became more useful alive than dead. Because Indian agriculture was subject to the vagaries of the monsoon. The monsoon was very capricious. And farmers who took a short-term view of slaughtering the cows and consuming the beef, eventually lost out, because after the monsoon arrived, you needed to have cows, you needed to have the oxen to plow the fields and continue agriculture. And therefore, those who took a long-term view by preserving the cattle, eventually were better off, and that particular culture spread. And eventually the cow was a useful animal. The cow is an animal that is useful in many different respects. It provides dung, which can be used as fuel. It produces milk. So there's no need to kill the cow, but rather than use the cow, for these other utilities. I think one can draw similar parallels with the origin of Ganesha. Now, so these are some of the early forms of Ganesha. There's another one in Udayagiri cave. Now, if you look at the antecedents of Ganesha, this is again a long story. Again, I don't want to get into great amount of detail because historians of religion have always been puzzled as to what the antecedents of Ganesha are. They're not even very sure how Ganesha arose, who are the antecedents of Ganesha. But what people agree is that the Ganesha came from a group of deities, or a single deity, or a group of deities called Vinayaka. Now, or Vignaraja. Now, Vignaraja means a creator of obstacles. Today in India, we know of Ganesha as the remover of obstacles. But there was this transformation in history, on our history. So eventually, again, you can read my book to get the whole story. A malevolent Ganesha. Ganesha was in some of these earlier writings is thought of as a malevolent deity who had to be appeased to avoid personal ills. Okay, not the benevolent deity that we know today, the jolly Ganesha, the dancing Ganesha, who can remove all obstacles. And there's this wonderful book by G.S. Gurye. This is written about 50 or 60 years ago. And he writes, a very radical transformation was needed to enthrone Ganesha, being the lord of obstacles, as the destroyer or remover of obstacles. He says such transformation inhere in the very nature of early religio-magical systems. One who is the lord of anything can be trusted to control and subdue the thing that he is lord of. So Vinayaka, the troublemaker, becomes the much prayed to trouble averter Ganesha. And he stops with that. Okay, so purely as a historian of religion. And I would go a step further and draw a parallel with the origin of the sacred cow. In that, if you look at pre-Aryan societies, they would have been in conflict with elephants over crops. This is something that is, as a field biologist, I know very well the kind of conflict that takes place today. Eventually, as the Aryans came in, they expanded across the Indo-Gangetic basin. They cleared very large areas. This conflict would have intensified. But as the conflict intensified, the elephant is a creature that had to be feared, and an elephant deity appeased. But eventually, the elephant was eliminated over a large area of the Gangetic basin. But the elephant was found still along in the peripheral areas. If you look to the Vindhyas, the elephants would have been found. Along the Himalayan foothills, the elephants would have been still found. And they still would have been in conflict and still would have been a threat to small agricultural societies in these areas. People whom we call native peoples or indigenous peoples or tribals or whatever today. And on the other hand, if you look at the rise of kingdoms and republics and empire, eventually the rise of republics first and then kingdom and empire, to this elite Aryan society, the elephant was no more a threat, because you had eliminated elephants over a very large area. The elephant is not a threat to the rulers of Delhi today, people who make policy about wildlife conservation today. The same way the elephant would not have been a threat over a very large part of the Indo-Gangetic basin. But on the other hand, elephants were useful alive in the armies. And therefore to them the elephant was more useful alive in armies as a beast of burden than dead for meat or for ivory. And the elephant was thus a very positive force. So I think it's pretty easy to see how the elephant became sacred, and we can draw parallels with today's social conflicts over conservation, because people from Delhi and Bombay and Bangalore, we try to decide, that you guys who are living in the forest, you tribals, you have to put up with tigers and with elephants and with all the different conflicts. We won't allow you to do anything to them. Perhaps in ancient times they entered into a pact with these tribals that, okay, just like we want to provide incentives to people to conserve, yet you capture elephants and give it to us, and maybe we'll use them in the armies or whatever, maybe, we don't know. But I will again speculate that this is something I have mentioned very briefly in my book, that Brahminical Hinduism had to compete with a rising, Buddhism. Buddhism was very popular in India, and Buddhism had made, quite a lot of inroads into society, especially in the north, and almost as far south as Karnataka or whatever. And perhaps this was a brilliant flash of inspiration to somebody, that if Buddhism had a sacred elephant, Hinduism's answer, Brahminical Hinduism's answer, is Ganesha. And Ganesha was perhaps a kind of a response to the Gajatame, if I may use a term, the Gajatame are the supreme elephant of Buddhism. So Ganesha was Hinduism's counter to Gajatame of Buddhism. And eventually Buddhism declined. By the period of the Guptas, Buddhism began to decline. And people perhaps began to rally around Ganesha. And if you look at Ganesha, you look at all the symbols associated with Ganesha: sugarcane, radish, bolo sweets. They are all agricultural and related to food. So eventually perhaps, there was some kind of a syncretic coming together of various deities, local deities that the native people were worshipping, elephant-headed deities that had to be appeased to avoid personal ills, and somebody came up, and Brahminical Hinduism came up with this brilliant flash of the idea of Ganesha, and so Ganesha was born by about the 4th century or so. Guriya says that the worship of Ganesha first arose among the elite of Aryan society and was only grudgingly accepted by the commoners. He has traced the history of Ganesha to a certain extent. And since the elephant was to be feared and propitiated, there was reason to stress the humble origins of Ganesha. So perhaps a local totemic, an elephant-headed deity that was being used by Dravidians, let us say, perhaps may have been adopted by Brahminical Hinduism, which is very recurrent theme in Brahminical Hinduism eventually. But something very interesting happens later, because the elephant was first sacred in Buddhism and only much later in Hinduism. Buddhism spreads from India into Nepal, into Tibet, and so on and so forth. But eventually, Ganesha takes on a very tantric form in Buddhism outside India, in places like Tibet and China, for instance. So eventually, if you actually look at this whole history, the positive sacred elephant of Buddhist Ashoka fails to define the tantric elephant-headed deity. It's a negative force requiring propitiation of China, in contrast to the negative Vinayaka being transformed into the positive Ganesha of India. So you have this entire flip-flop in history. Elephant is considered sacred in Buddhism, but then takes on a tantric form. Ganesha, is originally a negative Vinayaka, and then becomes the positive elephant-headed deity in Brahminical Hinduism. And I just wanted to put up this one sculpture to you. I don't know if you can see this figure who's being trampled by Vignantaka, who's the Buddhist destroyer of obstacles. This is a sculpture from Nepal. So in Buddhist Nepal, the Ganesha had to be overcome. Ganesha was not something that is accepted in Buddhism eventually. This is a quote from Alice Getty, who wrote this wonderful book on Ganesha in 1931, the first monograph on Ganesha. A Pandit was performing special rites on the banks of the river Bagmati. And Ganesh, wishing to prevent the pious Buddhists from attaining Siddhi, put insurmountable obstacles in his way. The Pandit invoked the Buddhist destroyer of obstacles, who appeared in the fierce form of Vignantaka, and Ganesh was overcome. So Ganesha eventually takes on a very different form. I'll just take another 3 or 4 minutes to finish my talk. I just can't help but compare the Manasolasa with the Kautilya Arthasastra. The Manasolasa is attributed to King Somadeva III from the 12th century of the Common Era. The form of elephant management seems to have changed. It repeats the Manasolasa repeats the assertion of the Gajavanas. It adds the description of the Kalingavana to the Dravida Deshavana, which is going to the extreme south of the country. But it says that the king should protect the elephant forest with the help of forest dwellers, not a superintendent of elephant forest like what Kautilya Arthasastra had prescribed. So perhaps this is like today's, discussion about the role of people in wildlife conservation, that participatory kind of protection of elephants and so on. Interestingly, the Manasolasa also adds the Aparanta Vana to Saurashtra Vana and Panchananda Vana as being inferior for elephants. And I think this to me is very interesting because the Aparanta Vana is the area of the northern Western Ghats. And by this time of the 12th century, the northern Western Ghats, which is Maharashtra, was highly degraded. It was in an advanced stage of degradation and therefore could not support elephants anymore. So this perhaps also tells an ecological story. So these are the small things that I try to interpret from the historical writings and add some extra value to it. Okay. I think I have just 2 or 3 more slides. The elephant in Mughal times. The Islamic rulers came into India about 1,000 years ago, and they began to build up. They began to absorb the local elephant culture. The Delhi Sultanate, for instance, had several thousand elephants in their armies, and the Mughals, really raised the elephant culture to new heights. Akbar, the Emperor Akbar, had a personal relationship with elephants. Akbar was fond of, according to his biographer, Abul Fazl, he reveled in taming the fiercest elephant. This meant the bull elephants in Mast. So you would go and he would confront a bull elephant in Mast head on, catch hold of its tusks, jump on its back and try to tame it. Even if some of this is exaggeration, I'm sure there is a lot of truth, a certain amount of truth in these statements. And Akbar had 101 personal elephants for his use, and he took very good care of his elephants. Again, good descriptions in the Aini Akbari and the Akbarnama about how you look after elephants and so on and so forth. And here he's riding the elephant Hawaii. This is a painting from the Akbarnama, which is there in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And possibly the size of elephant armies in the subcontinent reached a peak during the time of Emperor Jahangir and Emperor Akbar. In fact, Shireen Musbi has documented the total numbers of elephants, captive elephants that may have been found in the subcontinent, and I have made some minor changes to it. But we have come up with an estimate of in the entire subcontinent there could have been about 17,000 elephants at the peak of the captive elephants, at the peak of the Mughal period. We then come to the British period, where forest preserves, the British were interested in preserving the forests for logging, for the timber, because eventually timber was needed to build the shipyards back in Britain, to build the ships themselves, to raise settlements in India, especially in the hill regions of India. And elephants were indispensable to logging operations. So they organized the whole scientific forestry, the way in which elephants were, the veterinary care of elephants, the science of veterinary science that arose in Europe, largely in the context of looking after horses and so on and so forth, eventually came to the subcontinent, to India and to Burma. And there were monographs written about elephants and their diseases, E.H. Evans, that goes back about 100 years. So they introduced the science of veterinary sciences, the new Gajasastra, the colonial Gajasastra, into where they, of course, borrowed from some of the earlier writings of the Sanskrit writings also. And they set up game preserves to ensure the protection of animals that they hunted for sport. However, they also hunted elephants for sport. They used elephants So they used elephant in the conquest of empire. They used elephants. In fact, Mahesh Rangarajan, environmental historian who I believe has come and spoken here, says that British saw, they had to subdue the land, that they wanted to conquer. And what better way of doing it apart than to conquer the animals that these are the lawless beasts like the tigers and the leopards and the wolves and the elephants and so on. So, but fortunately, the slaughter of elephants was not as great as it could have been, and they also set up reserves for protection of elephants starting from the late 19th century. But eventually, elephant was used in the conquest of India and Burma and in the building of the British Empire. But eventually, I think the elephant had its revenge in the form of Lord Ganesha, because Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was a nationalist Indian leader, he raised the the cult of Ganesha. He used Ganesha as an icon for rallying the people in the India's independence movement. And the Ganesh festival, which is unfortunately partly degraded today in the country, was something. The Ganapati festival is, you go to Maharashtra, you go to places like Bombay and Mumbai and Pune and so on. This is where you find the the most elaborate expressions of the Ganapati festival today. It's a huge thing that goes on for about 10 days or so. This started off, the Ganapati Mandal started off by Bal Gangadhar Tilak. And he converted Ganesha into a powerful symbol of resistance against the British. So this sufficiently alarmed the British administrators. In fact, M.M. Underhill wrote in 1921, the growing interest among students in politics and the adoption of Ganesha as their patron god have united to connect him closely with the nationalist movement. And Mount Stuart Elphinstone, the governor of Bombay, was even more forthright when he wrote, one talisman, that is Ganesha, that while it animated and united them all, could leave us without a single adherent. This barbarism in the name of religion, a power so obvious that is astonishing that our enemies have not more frequently and systematically employed it against us. So I would say that India's independence in 1947 was a triumph of the nationalist elephant over the imperial line. Thank you.